In February 2017, Ulysses Bryant, the Senior Director, Chief of Police of the Savannah-Chatham County Public Schools, gave a talk at the inauguration of Massie Heritage Center's exhibit, Enslavement to Emancipation, the Struggle for Education. He spoke of his experiences from the summer of 1963, when he was handpicked, along with a group of students, by the esteemed civil rights leader, Mr. Wesley Wallace Law, to begin a movement towards the desegregation of high schools in Savannah. These were Savannah High and Groves High School. Massie's curator, Stephen Smith, had the opportunity to interview Chief Bryant at this time and got to hear his first-hand accounts as he looked back into the turbulent civil rights era in Savannah. He reflected upon his childhood, the civil rights movement, the powerful teachers that influenced him, his experiences integrating Savannah High School, and entering the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. Chief Bryant tells us harrowing stories of bullying and important lessons that were learned along the way. He also shares his valuable insights for what the future can hold and how far we have come. This is his story.
Yeah, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about your childhood, growing up in Savannah, and what segregation was like in Savannah when you were a child.
Well, I grew up on Savannah's east side. I was born on East Boundary Street at 207 East Boundary. I'm the oldest of 4 boys, and all of us are still living. My mom and dad are deceased. And we grew up, I grew up in the house with my maternal paternal grandmother, my father's mother. And she was very much instrumental in my growing up, being the firstborn. I can remember her being there for me at an early age. And of course my mom, she was a homemaker. She didn't work outside of the house. Dad was a longshoreman. And as I remember, it was a 2-story house right there in what we call the old fort area. And then Daddy moved us out to 111 Pounder Street off of Wheaton. And it was a dead-end street. We called it the bottom because we lived in the bottom. And growing up there at elementary school, I attended Paulson Street School, which was very close to where Hubert Middle School is today. And I went there until they built Spencer Elementary and opened that in 1955 on Boyne Street, which was right around the corner from where I lived at, so I could walk from home to school in just about 3 minutes or so. That was very much a part of, a neighborhood school. And when I think back and reflect back on the neighborhood itself, everyone knew everyone, everybody knew everybody, and they were all our parents, the neighbors. If they told you, they see you're doing some mischief or what have you, they'd say something to you, and you would listen. We were never disrespectful. My brothers were right in line behind me, and it was really eye-opening when I had a chance to reflect back on the condition, because when we were growing up, I thought at the time, with water fountain being white here, colored here, restroom white here, colored here, that was the norm, because that was the conditions that we were growing up under. But in our home, my parents, they always instilled in us that nobody was better than we were. And we grew up with that notion that, hey, no one's better than us.
So was civil rights ever a discussion in your home, or the idea that one day things might possibly change, that integration might happen?
Well, it's funny that that question would come up because it wasn't discussed as a matter of fact, but my mom, she was the more vocal one in the family. Dad would always sort of take the low road, but taking nothing away from him, he was a great dad. But Mom was more or less the assertive one. She would say what's on her mind and moved on. But when I think about the mention of civil rights, back in those days, the church was the focal point of not only your religious upbringing, but also as a matter of community involved events. And I raised up at Central Baptist Church, which was and still is in Hitch Village. And at the time it was Reverend Daniel was the pastor. And a lot of what was transmitted through the civil rights program would be announced in church. And of course we had the church meetings and what have you. So that's when I became somewhat involved with the civil rights movement. At an early age, I would say I was around 12, 13 years old when I began to realize that, well, things should be different and that possibly things would be changed. But at that time, I never thought that I would be as actively involved as I became.
You mentioned your grandmother, and I know your mom was a very powerful influence in your life, and your dad as well, but anybody outside of your immediate family that had a pivotal influence when you was a child?
Oh, yes. Lieutenant John White. He lived on Bowen Street, right across from Spencer School, and he's still living there. Matter of fact, he's the only surviving member of the original 9 African American police officers that worked on Savannah Police Department, and he was always there for us. He was encouraging. Matter of fact, every chance I get now, I still stop by and peep in on him when we have events that he goes to, or I meet him up somewhere. He said, "That's my boy," and I said, "That's my man," you know. But yes, John White, he retired policeman, and he was one of the first, and he still says, "That's my son." So yeah.
Anybody else?
Gwen Goodman, the late Gwen Goodman, she was one of my high school teachers. She was very encouraging, very empowering, and Richard Mole, John Miles, and the list of teachers that, you know, even during segregation, we had some powerful teachers under the segregated conditions. One thing they instilled in us, even though we had hand-me-down books and or no books at all, they made sure that we learned, and we received a quality education that even if I hadn't have had the opportunity to attend Savannah High when I did, I still felt that I was receiving the best possible education under the existing conditions that one could receive.
How did you come to know W.W. Law?
Through the civil rights movement, and I heard his name, I heard of him, and as we began to, as the movement began to evolve, I got a chance to meet him at one of the meetings. I think it was at Tremont Baptist Church. I'm thinking that's where I first met him personally and got the opportunity. And he wasn't a tall man, but when he spoke, people listened. And he wasn't loud, but he was very articulate and very determined. And as time moved on, I got to meet him. I was really surprised when he showed up at my front door that afternoon, and I'm wondering, like, why is this man here? And I greeted him at the front door when he came that day, and he asked to speak to my parents, and I said yes, certainly. And I got my mom. I invited him in because I knew who he was. He was with Reverend Snell, and I got my mom and brought him up to the living room, and then, I went on about my business. Because back in the day when grown people were talking, if you weren't invited in, then you made yourself, you got out of there.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was summoned to the living room, and my mom called me, she says, I don't know, that was my nickname. I said, come here. And when she called me, she says, Mr. Law and Reverend Stell wants to talk with you. And I'm like, my heart went up and down, like, what do they want to talk to me about? What did I do? What's going on? And then they, told me about wanting to move the movement forward, and that they were interested in knowing whether I would be interested in seeking a transfer from South C. Johnson to all-white Savannah High. And after taking a deep breath, I'm saying, me? He says, yes, you. So
Well,
that
what
started it.
characteristics or qualities that you think he was looking for in choosing students to integrate Savannah High?
Steve, that's a very good question. I couldn't imagine, why they would, choose me. Yes, I consider myself a very good student. My grades were good, and I had a pretty good demeanor about me overall, but I just didn't see where I rose to that, level that they would want me to take this on. I had no special training as such or preparation, but they knew who they were looking for and the qualities they were seeking, and with my mom's permission, the rest is history.
Did you consider yourself a leader at that age? Do you think he was looking for leadership qualities?
Not necessarily, but then being the oldest of four boys, I guess I was forced into that, thrust into that leadership role, because when mom and dad were out of the house or, going at different places, my grandmother would be there with us, but I was the oldest, and mom made it very plain that if anything happened to this house while I'm going, you're responsible. And that was non-negotiable. So yes, I think I must have been somewhat of a leader.
Well, let's go to that day when you actually went to Savannah High and you enrolled, and there's the famous picture of you and the other students walking up the steps. Do you remember exactly what was going through your mind at that moment?
Oh my gosh. I think I do. And many times I've looked at that photo and looked at the expression or the lack of expression, but there was a sense of determination, there was a sense of deliberateness. Because mind you, I had walked by that school from a distance and admired and wondered what it looked like inside, but because being a Negro, I couldn't go there. I couldn't even think about going there. Now here the opportunity presents itself, and I was accepted and approved by the Board of Education, because that's what we had to do. We had to make an application to the Board of Education for a transfer from Johnson to Savannah High. And all of the people in that picture with me were students at the time at Johnson High. That I remember, all of them were students at Johnson High. So going in there, there was a level of anxiety for me, not knowing what lied on the other side of those doors. But at the same time, I felt honored and humbled, and my emotions were all over the place as to what would it be like once we're registered.
Well, tell us a little bit about that first year. What were some of the hardships you had to endure? Was there pleasant times?
It was beyond my expectations, and trying to clarify that, there were well over 1,000 students at Savannah High at that time. It's a very large school. It looks huge from the outside. Once you get inside, it's really big. And we only had 12 of us in there. And there were about, there were about at least 12 to 1,500 students in there. It was 6 boys and 6 girls there at Savannah High that desegregated, 11 plus myself. And at least 7 of us were from Johnson High, so I knew them. And then you got it. Was it a culture shock for me? That's an understatement. It was beyond that. But the tension, the uncertainty. There were times when we could go all day and not see each other. I don't know how they managed that, but they did. And the most anxious times that I had personally was the change of class. When the students came out, and I was walking along the hall with my books tucked up, and someone would come back and jostle them from the back, and they hit the floor, and then you try to pick them up, and someone had kicked them. So that was really frustrating, and I found that the best defense that I had was when class change would come about, then I would stand against the wall until the mass moved beyond me and then moved along, because we didn't really have a lot of the teachers that were looking out for us. There were a few, but not many. Mm-hmm. There was a time when I allowed myself to get behind in the woodshop class. We were leaving woodshop, and I must have got killed. Someone got behind me and they hit me in the head with a piece of wood, and then it knocked me just about unconscious. But I know when I came to my senses, I was in a nurse's office with a lump on my head. And there was another time in the cafeteria where I was trying to eat lunch. One of the few times that I would actually venture into the lunchroom, and a crowd came around me and one spit in my food. Things like that. It was just sometimes it was just intolerable. And then there was an occasion where they put sugar in my tank. Someone put sugar in my tank. I parked my car down the road a little bit, and I thank God I didn't crank it up. I sensed that there was something wrong, and we towed the car in, dropped the tank, blew it out, and I was back to school the next day with the same car. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there were trying times.
Didn't you run into some issues right before graduation where you thought you got to sit out?
I got to sit out. Matter of fact, there was threats made on my life, and the policemen, the detectives that used to escort us back and forth, when they got wind of it, they actually came to class, escorted me out, gave me my cap and gown, and sent me home. Hmm. And I didn't get to see that class again until graduation day at Grayson Stadium.
So what were you like before that year, and what were you like after? Or in other words, how did that year change your life?
It changed my life because it gave me a greater appreciation of tolerance, the difference in other diversity, appreciation for the diversity. There were some wonderful people that I met at that school, and one lady pops out in my mind right away, Elizabeth Deal. She's deceased now, but she was my English teacher. And she would encourage me. She did everything that she could. She, tried to look out for me. And she introduced me to Paul Lawrence Dunbar, who was the first nationally recognized Negro poet. And I remember the poem that she shared with me was "The Path" by Paul Lawrence Dunbar. And I still have that a great portion of that poem that I remember to heart. And it's about the struggle, and that nothing is easy, and that there will be times that persevere, but you cannot succeed unless you thrust those looming rocks aside. And when I left after the experience at Savannah High, I didn't leave there full of hate. I left there with appreciation for the differences, a tolerance for the differences, And it's all right to disagree, but, be civil about it. We don't have to don't have to be hostile.
Right.
And I've carried that thus far through life.
So, what did you pursue in life after you graduated from Savannah High?
Believe it or not, my plans was to go straight into college because had I stayed at Johnson High, I was on a career path where I would probably have gotten some scholarships, my grades, and the people behind me. But I guess the intent was so much on addressing the desegregation efforts that to further my education part sort of fell through the cracks. So there was I was faced with, what do I do now? And of course Vietnam was roaring and going on, but I graduated in June. August 12th, I enlisted in the Air Force. I did not want to be a police officer, but I wound up being a security policeman. My AFSC wound up being stationed back here at Hunter, and I spent about a little over 12 years in the Air Force. Came out of the Air Force and subsequently went into law enforcement, and that's when I started my climb in law enforcement in August of 1977. Well, December of 1977, I went on the county police department.
Don't you think, though, it's possible, though, that year, the influence it had as it gave you a greater appreciation for justice and law? And
Yes. I had a healthy respect, always had a healthy respect for law enforcement and for the justice movement. So maybe subconsciously, that's where my heart was. But once I got into it, I stayed there, and I experienced some things in law enforcement that weren't pleasant right here in Chatham County. But that's not the majority. That's that minority bunch that people behave with uncivilized.
Well, let me rephrase that question because I didn't ask it the right way. Do you think that it gave you a greater interest in justice and for law enforcement that year? But you already answered the question. I just asked it.
Yes, yes, yeah. It did, most certainly. And I'm proud to say that not only did it give me a greater appreciation, but yeah, I guess I transmitted it to my children. I have 4 daughters, and all 4 of them at one time was in law enforcement. Every one of them wear a uniform. I have 2 daughters in Massachusetts. They made their home there. One's a court bailiff officer, the other's a colonel with Suffolk County Sheriff's Department. My youngest daughter, she was with the Sheriff's Department, Chatham County Sheriff's Department, for 17 years. She left as a lieutenant, and now she works for the school board police department. And she always wanted to work for the school board police department, but I told her, I said, you cannot work for your daddy, no. And then the older one, she was at the Sheriff's Department, but now she's working at the county and in another capacity outside law enforcement. And then one of my son-in-laws, he's a homicide detective with Metropolitan Police, and that's the youngest daughter's husband. So yeah, we got a whole bunch of law enforcement there, and I'm currently working at Savannah State as interim chief of police.
Right. So you started as a police officer with Metro.
No, with let me excuse the interruption, with Chatham County Police Department. Back when the city limits of Savannah stopped at Stevenson Avenue.
Okay.
And everything beyond that was unincorporated county.
Right. So you
and
started.
Al St. Lawrence was the chief of police.
All right. And so, as a police officer, did you encounter instances of racism a lot within the force and within the community?
Not so much in the force, because I got to tell you, back in the 70s, there was not a lot of county police, and the county was sparsely populated. But we were a tough, a close-knit bunch, because one person, your safety and security depended on your fellow officer. So if you needed a backup, regardless of who you were or what your personal feelings were, that was put aside. The job came first. Now, as far as encountering some citizens who had other mindsets, yes, I went on calls in some areas of the county, and answered the call, and the guy was coming to the door, said, "I didn't call no nigger police here." And I'm like, wow.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I encountered incidents of that type.
So how did you come to be chief of campus police?
Well, there's a little history behind that, because I was on the county on the Board of Education Police for a number of years. Oh gosh, more than 12, 15 years, and I finally got to the level of captain, and in one place the current chief at that time had to step down, and I became the interim chief. And after some going around, the department had just been almost dissolved to just me being the only full-time police officer. And then I got an opportunity in 1997 where I was given the opportunity to reorganize the police department, because the county police had officers in the school, but at that juncture they wanted the school board to pay for the police services and what have you. The school board wasn't having none of that, so we reorganized, and they allowed me to hire 26 officers and equip them and place them in the school, and we got started. And then it came down to the point of who was going to actually be the chief. And I worked for Tom Wagner, who was the chief operation officer at the time, and he supported me being the chief, being that I organized everything. Well, everyone wasn't in agreement with that, but through time I was given the opportunity to prove that I was capable of running that department, and it did come to fruition that I was appointed chief in 1998 until the time I retired in 2014.
Well, it was right after I came on.
And of course I went back a couple of times, but yeah, I retired in 2014.
Well, this last question might be kind of a sensitive question, so I'll approach it carefully, but do you still feel our schools are too segregated? And do you have any thoughts on how we can make them more integrated, if so?
It is a delicate question, but I've always been one to express my feelings, and I believe that we have gone full circle. When the system, the district was granted unitary status, which takes us back to square one if we ever go through this process again, and in looking at the way the districting has taken place and the establishment of private schools and what have you. Yes, but I don't think that we'll ever go back to square one where we have mandatory. We've got enough busing as it is,
Right.
and I've got great grandchildren in the schools now, so I still have a vested interest. What I would like to see is more focus on our inner city schools to make sure that the playground is it's even, so that no matter what school a child goes to, that he or she will receive the best education possible.
Excellent. That's all the questions I have.
You said you remember the poem? Would you mind reciting a few verses?
Tom
of it?
Wagner?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I remember Tom very well. Matter of fact, when Deborah Andrews was still board secretary, when he would come down and stop by, or he's in the area, he would ask her, "How's Chief doing?" Because he'd keep up with me. I don't know where he is right now, but gosh, the last time I heard tell of him, it's been several years ago. But he was a fair and just guy, and Karen Matthews was the board president at that time, and I remember standing on the second floor looking out the window into the parking lot, and he and she were talking, and later that evening I got a call, and he says, all I want you to do is you stay focused and just keep doing what you're doing and show that you can do that job. He said, you're going to be all right. And I feel to this day that those two individuals were instrumental in me having that opportunity and being appointed as chief. And when the board did take the vote, it was unanimous for me to be the chief of police.